Hi, welcome. Got another book review, and this is the book. This is Panzers on the Vistula, Retreat and Rout in East Prussia, 1945. Actually goes from January to May of 1945. And it's by Hans Schäufler, who is one of the veterans of that campaign. It's quite an extraordinary book. Hans Schäufler was there the whole time. He gives his personal experiences, but he also quotes from other veterans and reports and gives a wider history of the campaign along the Vistula. So this is going to take you from Latvia to Poland and includes his escape all the way to Western Germany, just below Denmark. So an extraordinary book in many ways. This I'm going to forewarn you. I'm going to recommend this without any caveats at all. It's a really extraordinary book, but I'm going to show you some of the parameters of the book before I explain my recommendation, so you appreciate what you're getting. So this looks like a thin hardback, and it is a thin hardback. It's actually thinner in main content than it looks because it's got a lot of maps, photographs, and it has an appendix of a chronology. So that you can appreciate the main body content here ends at page 136, which is here, and then there is a timeline. So 136 pages of main body text, which isn't a lot for when a history covers a campaign of this length, so almost 5 months. But it's got a lot of photographs, and I'm going to show you some of those. So it's actually got 16 pages of black and white photographs, and these are mostly taken by the author himself. There's some quite extraordinary photographs amongst these photographs I certainly haven't seen before. And so you have 16 pages, and there are 16 pages of photographs. There are 36 individual photographs. Let me just check that. So 30, it's going to be more. It's actually 42 individual photographs on 16 pages. You've also got 7 pages of maps, and I'm going to show you some of these. So 7 pages of maps. The maps are actually not that good. You can see they've been rendered on an old-fashioned computer software, probably by the author himself. The German version of this book was published in 1991, if I'm not mistaken. And the maps date from that time. They haven't been updated. So just bear that in mind. There are good reasons to recommend this book. The other parameter I should note to you is that the book, for its length, is reasonably expensive, and I think that's because of the translation costs and then the high quality of the content. So the list price is $32 US.95, so $32 US.95, so essentially $33 US. UK price pounds is £19.99, so essentially £20. That's a list price. You may get it cheaper from Amazon, but not always. Amazon is increasingly charging list price for military history books. So I'm going to give you those parameters up front before I explain to you why I'm recommending this. It's a really extraordinary book. The experiences by the author himself are extraordinary. It contains a lot of events that I have not heard about before, and the photographs are extraordinary. And I appreciate the authenticity of this author weaving his own experiences with the wider history of the campaign. And the campaign is fascinating for lots of reasons. I'll forewarn you that one of the most interesting, or let's say extraordinary, aspect of the campaign is that the German pocket near Gdansk survives. It contracts, but it survives beyond the end of the war. So it's still holding out at the end of the war. Troops are trying to escape to the west, and actually the fighting continues beyond the Western Front's armistice, and even somewhat beyond the Eastern Front's armistice, and troops are still escaping through most of May of 1945. So this campaign has a lot of legs to it, so almost 5 months. So let me show you where this starts. So it starts January, goes to May of 1945. Hans Schäufler was in charge of wireless communications with the 4th Panzer Division, which starts in Kurland, I'll show you a map of this because, extraordinarily enough, there is no map in the book of where he starts. So this Kurland is marked here by this red dot on the map, modern political map. The red dot is actually the biggest city in Kurland. So Kurland is where 4th Panzer Division was resting after its long fights through 1944 on the Eastern Front. Kurland means area where you take the cure. So appropriate that they're taking a rest, so taking the cure, so swimming in the sea and drinking spring water and things like that. So it was a resort, and they were very happy there, but they're going to get mobilized to go to the area around Gdansk in what is now Poland. So this is the front cover of the book, and I'm going to show you the front matter so that you have the instructions for how to buy this book. So Panzers on the Vistula and Schäufler, pen and sword, military. Actually, Casemate is the overall publisher of this book. Originally published in 1991 in German. This edition is from 2018. You have 18 short chapters in this book, and then an appended timeline. The book is nicely bound, nicely made up. It will look handsome on your shelf. I should point out, I told you there are 42 photographs in here. This is the list of 42 photographs. Actually, incorrectly titled here, list of maps, but these are actually the photographs. The photographs, all 42 of those, are genuinely from the front we're talking about in this particular book. They don't include the photographs that are on the cover. So this is a Jagdpanther on the Western Front, and this is also a Jagdpanther on the Western Front. Now, there are a few Jagdpanther which appear in the story, but these photographs have nothing to do with this particular campaign. One of the advantages of this book is that you get honest appraisal of the morale and the assessments of Germany's prospects from the soldiers at this time for the final 5 months of the war. And Hans Schäufler is not, he doesn't spare his feelings on what was going on. So it's interesting, he keeps talking about the general sense of the German soldier about what their prospects were. And it was clear that the prospects were not good for Germany by January 1945, but that doesn't diminish how hard the soldiers are fighting, because they're trying to protect refugees escaping west, and they're trying to protect their own forces escaping west. So there's no let up in their fighting motivations, even though their political motivations are certainly floundering. So there's a good quote here. This is from chapter 3, where he's talking about news of massacres by Soviet troops when they first get to German urban areas in East Prussia. So the first massacre that his force hears about was at Neumensdorf on 20th of October 1944, and that added to their motivations. When he gets to Gdansk area in January 1944, quote, "We saw German people in flight for the first time. Our hearts bled for them, convoys of children led by brave young women, nuns and Red Cross sisters, horse-drawn wagons with the sick and aged, women, wounded and even more wounded, distress, exclamation mark. And they all silently begged us with reproachful glances to keep the Soviets from them and not leave them in the lurch." So there's the motivations to keep fighting, but it's clear that not everybody agrees with the author here about fighting on. So the text quote continues, "Exhausted, disappointed German soldiers stood in the way for a moment with clenched fists. Stupid fools prolonging the war," in quotation marks. And we too wondered whether we were doing the right thing in confronting the Soviets again in view of this hopeless situation. And then another interesting insight it's about the relationship between frontline troops and the rear services. It has to be said that relationship had significantly deteriorated during the big retreat from Russia. While the front lines were manned ever more thinly from year to year, the base cities bulged with supply service officers, administrative staff, party officials, specialists, and people wanting to prolong the war, but who ran for the exit as soon as sounds of battle could be heard. Over time, this had embittered the frontline soldiers, who classified these people, JWD, for quite far behind. So that's the sort of political aspect of this part of the war. Then there's a lot of details about how the 4th Panzer Division is recouping its equipment locally. And there's going to be some insights here about the technological balance and the operational balance. So, for instance, this is on page 11. Against the Joseph Stalin tank, our otherwise excellent 75mm L48, so that's the largest gun mounted in the Panzer IV, had little effect. Only a lucky strike could get through its strong armor. So that's one of those insights, technological insights, you're going to get repeatedly in this book. It's one of the reasons I appreciate it. So then they're starting to receive tanks, actually mostly self-propelled guns rather than tanks at this period, but they're getting tanks beyond the ammunition and the fuel needed to operate these vehicles. So, for instance, they've got a lot of 8-wheeled armored cars with the latest version with 75mm guns. They've got lots of half-tracks, armored half-tracks with 20mm cannons and 75mm short-barreled howitzers, and they get 14 Jagdpanther IVs. It's not clear whether they're armed with the longer version of the 75mm gun, that would be the L70, or whether they're still armed with the L40, but they can't use them immediately because they don't have the fuel to move them and they don't have the ammunition. So that's going to be a recurring theme in here. There's another, so what frequently the author, one of the author's techniques here to generalize the understanding of the campaign is keeps reaching for journalistic quotes from war correspondents who are on the same front. So Hans Schäufler does give you some interesting insights from his own experiences, but as somebody in charge of the wireless operations of the division, actually the Panzer Regiment, he is usually with HQ staff. He's actually not on the front line. So he compensates for that by doing a lot of quotes from other veterans and particularly war correspondents. And the war correspondents are this. I'll give you this first one, but it's a generally true about the German war correspondents, that their observations are derived from going to the front line inside tanks. I mean, they're all riding on the back of tanks in this case. So Robert Payongsen, he takes part in an attack on 2nd of February 1945, and he's riding on the back of one of those Jagdpanther IVs, and therefore he's blown off the tank and wounded, and he's seeing what vehicles his vehicle is engaging, and he's seeing the return fire, and he's riding on the back of it, and he's trying to help the commander of that Jagdpanther IV engage targets. He's participating in this battle. It's quite an extraordinary approach to war reporting. There's no making up what's happening on the front line, which is a criticism often leveled at British war correspondents in particular. So, for instance, writing from Cairo what's happening in Tunisia was one of the stereotypes of British correspondents. So there's quite a few of these first-person quotes from war correspondents, which I found quite extraordinary. So I mentioned Robert Payongsen. I'll just give you, there's quite a few pages of this quote from him, and I'll give you one part of this because it's actually an example of a battle where Jagdpanther IVs are coming up against Joseph Stalin tanks. So, quote, one of our tanks 50 meters away from us was hit in the side. Then came an ear-deafening bang. I had long since made myself small behind the turret, pressing myself to the back like a bug. So at this point, he's talking about a turret, but it's a Jagdpanther 4, so it means the superstructure. Captain Kuspert, who was still with the whole of his body exposed above the turret, vanished with a crash like greased lightning, only one arm still sticking out. For a moment, it was quite dark around me. Lumps of snow and clods of earth came down like hail, and splinters banged against the steel. There was a shot through my glove, a millimeter from the forefinger. A 122 millimeter shell had exploded half a meter from our right-hand driving wheel. I'll just mention, I said I wasn't going to have any caveats on this book, so I'm going to give a caveat on the translation. So sometimes the translation is a bit clunky, and that quote illustrates that. So the part where it says, Captain Kuspert, who was still with the whole of his body exposed above the turret, you know, that you could improve the style of that in the English language. I mean, I can picture how that was originally written in German, but how it was structured in German is not how it should be structured in English. So I'll just make that note. Sometimes the translation needs a second reading to get the style right in your own head. So anyway, let's move on. There's lots of examples in this book I want to share with you, so you appreciate the detail. So here's another technological operational detail. So 18th of February, Captain Kästner reported from Danzig the arrival of 27 Panther tanks from Kurland and a further detachment of 23 Panthers from the administrative net. That would be from the west. The Panther, also known as Panzer V, was a heavy tank, latest construction, blah, blah, blah. Very accurate 75mm tank gun that could take on a Joseph Stalin. And there's a caption to one of his photographs where he says the 75mm L70, which was in the Panther, was as good as it gets, and it had nothing to fear from even the Joseph Stalin tanks. He seems to appreciate it more than the 88mm guns, which I've seen said before. So technically more penetrative, 75mm L70, technically more penetrative, but not necessarily more destructive than the 88mm guns. So the 1st Battalion, 1st Panzer Battalion of the 4th Panzer Division, it gets excited about these Panthers, but it actually has to take over some Jagdpanthers too. So it's a mix of Panthers and Jagdpanthers. So in terms of chassis, there's really no logistical difference in having the same chassis, but the tankers are used to fighting in turreted tanks and not limited traverse self-propelled guns. So there's a quote here from Hermann Bix, a platoon commander in that battalion. We were extremely angry when we had to take over Jagdpanthers instead of our usual Panzer Vs, which in the general chaos had failed to reach the self-propelled artillery battalion as expected. Then we were forced to examine the equipment a bit closer. The tanks had no swiveling turret. One had to aim with the whole tank, and one sat a little too much out in the open. But on the other hand, the steel monster disposed of a first-class 88mm gun with enormous penetrating power. So that's the 88mm L71, same as in the Tiger II. A fabulous range and great accuracy. So we quickly forgot the unusualness of the Jagdpanther and made ourselves familiar with its advantages. We soon had the opportunity of exploiting them to the full. Interestingly, the same person, Hermann Bix, goes on to describe their first engagement using the Jagdpanther. It's going to be against not a Soviet type of tank, but against Sherman tanks used by Soviet forces. They were firing at untypically short ranges given the gun they were using because of fog. So they cannot see the tanks until they're within 1,000 meters, and they nevertheless have a one-sided fight against the Soviet forces. And it says here that they started opening fire, or at least Hermann Bix decided he was going to open fire at 800 meters. So I'm going to share more with you from this account by Hermann Bix. He said, I had previously divided the terrain in front of me into set points and carefully established ranges. so I could reckon on hitting the leading tank with an armor-piercing shell when it reached the 800 meter mark. I do not know why, but my superb gun aimer did not hit the tank with his first round, but a vast tree on the road edge. The trunk broke apart and the crown as its thick branches fell on the leading tank, which slipped, having suddenly lost its vision, and fell head over heels into the deep roadside ditch and lay motionless. Following tanks closed up tight and stopped. Not having identified me, they all turned their turrets to the right and fired like a fire brigade at the dark heaps of earth of the abandoned infantry position. So he's actually on his own at this point because he's lost his comrades in the fog. Then it was an easy game as I had the broadsides of their turrets right in my line of fire, but we had to aim carefully. Moving on. Within 10 minutes, we had shot up 11 Soviet tanks in the column. The rest drove off in panic, trying to turn and getting stuck in the ditch where they were wrapped up in the flames and smoke from the long row of burning tanks. He is reversing and the tank can't get any grip. So the heavy engine of our tank, that's the Jagdpanther, howled loudly under the strain. We were only a few meters from solid ground, but the tracks churned away if the driver gave only a little more gas. Then I had an almighty shock. The Soviet tank was standing 300 meters right of us in the village. It had wound its way through, unnoticed by us, wormed its way between the houses, and apparently suspected no German tanks. However, as it only could happen, he spotted us, and I had to watch idly as he slowly turned his turret toward us. Remember, the Jagdpanther doesn't have a turret, so the Jagdpanther needs to get out of that boggy ground in order to bring its gun to bear. So the Soviet tank keeps missing, and they eventually get some grip. The gun aimer, right, so our tank turned slowly until we were in a firing position. The gun was clear and at the right height. The gun aimer carefully took aim. Our opponent was sinking ever deeper by the stem, so the Soviet tank, in its attempts to turn its front armor towards the Jagdpanther, has got itself sinking sideways into a bog. Then suddenly the turret hatch flew open and two hands stretched out and waved. Did the crew want to surrender, ? Or did they want to fool us? We were used to this sort of thing. No, I could take no risks. We fired our penultimate shell, meaning we only had 2 shells left to fire in the whole vehicle, into the projecting side of cover. Some awkward English there. We fired our penultimate shell into the projecting side to cover every eventuality. The crew jumped out, 1, 2, 3, 4 men, all in order. Then the last shell thundered into the Soviet tank and it immediately burst into flames. The 16th that morning, right? So 1 Jagdpanther, 16 claims in a few minutes. So on the 4th of March, the 4th Panzer Division is ordered to change its area of operations from Hardcover, which is actually to the right of this map, to the east of this map that you're looking at here. There's plenty of maps. I said there were 7 in this book, but they're actually quite difficult to follow. So Hardcover is here, and it's in this second map, and it would be located relative to this first map to the east. But they're asked to move all the way over to the left-hand edge of this map to Butov. There's a 50-kilometer drive, and the reason for that is the Soviets are coming round the bottom edge of the pocket around Danzig, around the southern edge, and they're going to actually end up cutting off the Danzig area from retreat west, except escaping by sea. So 4th of March, 4th Panzer Division is told to go to Butov, and this is where I have the first useful quote from the author of the book himself, Hans Schäufler. So most of what he's writing is about the division as a whole and is not in the first person, but by page 32 you get the first of Hans Schäufler's own personal experiences, and this is where he's riding with the commander of the whole Panzer Regiment. So Hans Schäufler describes how the the Panzer Regiment is actually too short of fuel to make those 55 kilometers on its own. It's ordered to load onto a goods train, but they are uncertain about the front. The front line is very fluid, and they're certainly exposed to air attack throughout that time. So, quote, "It was therefore ordered that all vehicles would be manned during the journey, their weapons ready for action, that it would perhaps be necessary to go straight into action from the train. All radios were on receive." That's his job, and Schäufler's job. The tank's smoke discharges were checked so that if the transport should be in danger, they could be suddenly discharged. The goods train moved slowly northwards, sometimes only at a walking pace. There, during the darkness, our train remained well covered. Now, as they approached Darmakov railway station, they heard a radio message. I presume Hans Schäufler took this message himself. Darmakov, strongly occupied by the enemy. Colonel Christian had the train stop so that we would not be seen from that place. We could hear the sound of fighting in the distance. But there was also a Darmakov between Butov and Groß-Tuchen that we had been talking about the day before. We had no idea which of the two Darmakovs was on our railway line, but could not ask as radio silence still applied. So the commander of the regiment, Panzer Regiment 35, he decides to take a reconnaissance himself in a soft-skin vehicle. And Hans Schäufler is cautioning him against this, but he describes his colonel as always dashing, sometimes a little too much for my taste. We drove on and on. And then Hans Schäufler says to his commander, "Colonel, look over there with your binoculars." Colonel replies, "Are you scared, Schäufler?" I had become sensitive to things like this during the course of the war, but I could not say this of my commander. But I said more drastically and louder than I'd intended, "God, no, but I've had enough of this." In a similar lone expedition by a colonel, we had nearly all been lost, and the regimental sergeant major had been killed. So he, Colonel, just at this moment, Hans Schäufler spotted, this quote, "spotted Soviet helmets in the thin bushes there, and there, and the mighty barrel of a heavy anti-tank gun that was aimed at us. We are in the middle of the Russians," I shouted into the ear of the nonplussed colonel, but he still doubted me. The incurable optimist. I poked the driver in the back, left a gravel pit into it at full speed. So they do reach that gravel pit, and the sound of fighting, they got no weapons with them to respond to the heavy weapons that the Soviets are firing at them. But the sound of the firing brings German tanks off the train to their rescue, and they are rescued just in the nick of time. So I like that. That's a very authentic first-person account of the tension between your commander's bravado and your own, as it turns out, more realistic assessment of the situation. There's an interesting little anecdote about the young boys, or essentially boys, teenagers that were mobilized to defend Germany at the last. So the story here is from Hans Schäufler. According to him, a tank destroyer company was assigned to the Panzer Grenadier Regiment. These were Hitler Jugend, or Hitler Youth, about 15 years old. There were 14 of them. They came on bicycles with Panzerfausts, so rocket-propelled anti-tank weapons. They behaved like grown-ups, this is a quote, and were convinced of the importance of the task, but the Panzer Grenadiers themselves took the Panzerfaust to use themselves and let the teenagers have a long sleep, and then they sent them home. Now, it's at this page actually that Schäufler introduces the first of a series of complaints about how the Western Allies are intervening in this battle on the Eastern Front, using strategic bombers principally, but air power in general, to intercept refugees and to destroy communication centers that refugees are passing through. And the most infamous or famous case of that is the city of Dresden, that is subjected to firebombing towards the end of the war at Soviet request, when it's absolutely jammed packed through with refugees and there's terrible civilian loss of life, and it is not in the Western Allied interest to help the Soviets to advance their front any closer when the Western Allies are desperately trying to catch up with the Soviet advance into Germany and prevent a divided Germany, but there is obviously a divided Germany in the end. So this is happening at the same time as Dresden, pretty much. He complains that the city of Danzig itself was attacked by American superfortress bombers coming from the west and flying off east, according to the German observations. Quote, Hans Schäufler again, "We had to watch this sad dance of death from our positions on the heights west of the town without doing anything, not a bomb falling on the fighting troops. On the night of the 20th, this is March, they came back from the east, dropped their bomb loads on the city virtually unhindered and flew off to the west. The city's meager air defenses could do little against them." You'll see that complaint about Western air power repeatedly in this book, even right to the end of the armistice, where their Western air power are knowingly or unknowingly sinking ships packed with thousands of civilian refugees escaping the Gdansk-Danzig pocket. We have another first-person account here from, in this case, Klaus Schiller, a one-armed second lieutenant and commander of the tank destroyer company, describing his experience. It's a long account and a fantastic one. He's taking on T-34s. It's unclear actually what vehicle he himself is riding. I presume it's a Jagdpanther, but it could be one of the Jagdpanzer IV. So towards the end of March, his tank destroyer company is ordered to assign Panzerfaust or Panzerfäuste to any personnel in the company who did not have vehicles to crew themselves. So they're going to have to attack on foot with portable weapons, which is something they've got no direct experience of previously. But according to this account, do very well at it. So I'll give you a quote here of how they did it. So, quote, "During the last days of the street fighting, we had developed a successful tank destroying tactic. We went through the attics, which were connected as an air raid precaution, using them as cover to get to the leading tanks, Soviet tanks. We put one man with a submachine gun at the window to cover us and aimed our Panzerfausts through holes in the roofs at the enemy tanks. The effect on the Soviets was quite devastating when suddenly a T-34 flew into the air. We used the confusion among the enemy to get away undetected and seek another target. In this manner, we forced the Soviets to advance quite slowly and cautiously. There was no lack of Panzerfausts. They were lying about everywhere. Unfortunately, the food supplies were not so. So there's another air attack on Danzig, on the Danzig area. So on the night of 22nd, 23rd of March, those US superfortresses come back and they bomb some towns around Danzig and kill thousands of civilians. There were no air raid shelters, according to Hans Schäufler. And the Soviets make their first bombing attack on the center of Danzig on the 24th of March. These are mostly using tactical bombers. And then according to Hans Schäufler, the asphalt layers on the streets and bridges caught fire. Clouds of smoke darkened the skies, making breathing difficult, particularly in the cellars. Many people died in the shelters. The sirens screamed even more frightfully. There were no fighters on our side and hardly any anti-aircraft fire. A few aircraft tumbled away after being hit by machine gun fire, but the apocalyptic mood in the dying city just increased. Those aspects of this campaign which I was not aware of before reading this book, and that is that there was many Western Allied prisoners who end up in this pocket. So page 70, Hans Schäufler talks about 32 British officer prisoners of war who about 4 weeks previously had come over to us in the Heiderode area. This is to the east of Danzig. They'd come over with white flags and spokesmen. They had credibly told us that they had been freed from German captivity in Schlossberg by Soviet soldiers and then transported east with an unknown destination. They had had no confidence in this release and had used a suitable opportunity to become independent and force their way through to the German front by night and fog, and they had pointedly, politely, and correctly begged, in that fine English manner, to come back and stay with us. If necessary, they declared, unasked, they would even be prepared to fight on the German side. So I've never heard this in British accounts before. If somebody knows about it, please let me know. I can imagine why, if Hans Schäufler's story is true, British officers saying to German soldiers during a war, their enemies, they'd be prepared to fight against them, against the Soviets, their allies. They're not going to admit that in public accounts once they get back to Britain. So this may be the only observation of this event, if Hans Schäufler is correct. I think that's a fascinating insight. It's either an insight into what really happened or an insight into what the Germans think the British would be doing in that situation. I wish there was a British account to back that up, one way or the other. And then he continues, there were French prisoners of war too. They had been assigned to the farming families in East and West Prussia, and quote, they carefully looked after their families, making sure they did not become separated with them in this turmoil. They were just about the only men with the treks, if one does not count the old folk. They were especially good to the children. This could not be overlooked. For 5 years, many Frenchmen had wanted to be with their own families. There were Polish volunteers, Russian volunteers, former Soviet soldiers that continued to stick with the Germans. They were going to be treated as traitors by the Soviet sign anyway. And then there's a list of other nationalities: West Prussians, East Prussians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Letts, Pomeranians, Poles, British, French, all ate at our field kitchens from appropriated vats and even bricked-in bathtubs. And thanks to our extraordinarily good organization, all were satisfied. So at this point, you get to the mid-March, the end of March, that the German forces are essentially confined to Danzig itself, and they're going to end up getting split between two different peninsulas. So in Polish, the Hel Peninsula up here in the Baltic Sea to the north of Danzig, and then there's another peninsula to the east. There's a number of complaints about the attacks on German cruise liners, which were being used to take refugees, civilians mostly, some wounded, military wounded, out of Danzig, and thousands of them drown. One example here is the Goya, 16th of April. It was bombed by Soviet aircraft, and about 7,000 people were killed aboard the Goya. It was at night in a freezing sea, so very few people had the chance to survive. And there's countless examples of that. Tragic maritime disasters of German ships trying to get refugees away and doing heroic job, but they're getting sunk at the eastern end as they're leaving Danzig, and they're actually getting sunk too by Western air forces as they approach Western Germany. So when you get to chapter 13, which is this much of the book, chapter 13, this is where Hans Schäufler really gets into the first person. So this is the final 40 pages or so of the 136 pages of main body contact. And he's there right at the end, and there are a lot of extraordinary stories where he's escaping over bridges just before they were getting bombed and things like that. I mean, really extraordinary stories. And then it's after the armistice. They're not supposed to be escaping under the terms of the armistice. They're supposed to be waiting for the Soviets to round them up, but they're generally unwilling to be rounded up on the Soviet side. They want to get to the West. So Hans Schäufler has a long story in these final 40 pages of how they find a motorboat, they struggle with other motorboats to get across stormy seas. They don't have a map apart from something they've torn out of an atlas, which is only as big as this book for the whole of the Baltic area.